So one might ask, where did this all begin? What we have today, really a world in a state of cumulative collapse. You get it started with John Locke. And John Locke introduces property, and he has three provisos for just private right and property. And the three provisos are that there must be enough left over for others, and that you must not let it spoil, and that you, most of all, must mix your labor with it. It seems justified. You mix your labor with the world, then you're entitled to the product, and as long as there's enough left over for others, and as long as it doesn't spoil, you don't allow anything to go to waste, that's okay. Well, he spends a long time of his famous treatise of government, and it's since been the canonical text for economic and political and legal understanding. It's still a classic text of study. Well, what he did is, after he gives the provisos, and you're almost thinking at the time whether you're for private property or not, he's given a very good and plausible and powerful defense of private property here. Well, he drops them. He drops them like that, right in one sentence. He says, well, once the introduction of money came in by men's tacit consent, then it became, and he doesn't say all the provisos are canceled, erased, but that's what happens. So now we have not product and your property earned by your own labor. Oh no, money buys labor now. There's no longer consideration of whether there's enough left over for others. There's no longer consideration of whether it spoils, because he says, well, money's like silver and gold can't spoil, therefore monies can't be responsible for waste, which is ridiculous. We're not talking about money and silver, we're talking about what its effects are. It's one non sequitur after another. Just the most startling logical legerdemain that he gets away with here. But it fits the interests of capital owners. Then Adam Smith comes along, and what he adds is the religion to this. Locke started with God made it all this way. This is God's right. And now we get also with Smith coming along, he says it's not only God's, I mean, he's not saying this, but this is what's happening philosophically in principle. He's saying it's not only a question of private property, that's all now presupposed, is given. And that there's money investors that buy labor, given. That there's no limit to how much they can buy of other men's labor, how much they can accumulate, how much inequality, that's all given now. And so he comes along, and what his big idea is, and again, it's just introduced in parentheses, en passant. You know, when people put out the goods for sale and others, you know, the supply, and other people buy them with the demand and so forth, how do we have supply equaling demand or demand equaling supply? How can they come into equilibrium? And that is one of the central notions of economics, is how do they come into equilibrium? And he says it's the invisible hand of the market that brings them into equilibrium. So now we have God is actually immanent. He just didn't give the rights to property and how, you know, all its wherewithal and its natural rights of doing all that Locke said. Now we have the system itself as God. In fact, Smith says, when he talks, and you'll never find this quoted, you have to read the whole of the Inquiry into the Wealth of Nations. He says, the scantiness of subsistence sets limits to the reproduction of the poor, and that nature can deal with this in no other way than elimination of their children. So he anticipated evolutionary theory in the worst sense. This is well before Darwin. And so he called them the race of laborers. So you can see there was inherent racism built in here. There was an inherent acceptance, life blindness to kill innumerable children. And he thought, well, that's the invisible hand making supply meet demand and demand meet supply. So see how wise God is. So you can see a lot of the really virulent, life-destructive, eco-genocidal things that are going on now have, in a way, a thought gene back in Smith too.
When we reflect on the original concept of the so-called free market capitalist system, as initiated by early economic philosophers such as Adam Smith, we see that the original intent of a market was based around real, tangible, life-supporting goods for trade. Adam Smith never fathomed that the most profitable economic sector on the planet would eventually be in the arena of financial trading or so-called investment, where money itself is simply gained by the movement of other money in an arbitrary game which holds zero productive merit to society. Yet, regardless of Smith's intent, the door for such seemingly anomalous advents was left wide open by one fundamental tenet of this theory. Money is treated as a commodity in and of itself. Today, in every economy of the world, regardless of the social system they claim, money is pursued for the sake of money and nothing else. The underlying idea, which was mysteriously qualified by Adam Smith with his religious declaration of the invisible hand, is that the narrow, self-interested pursuit of this fictional commodity will somehow magically manifest human and social well-being and progress. The reality is that the monetary incentive interest, or what some have termed the money sequence of value, has now completely decoupled from the foundational life interest, which could be termed the life sequence of value.
What has happened is that there's a complete confusion in economic doctrine between those two sequences. They think that the money sequence of value delivers the life sequence of value, and that's why they say if more goods are sold, if GDPs rise and so forth, therefore there'll be more well-being, enhanced well-being. We take the GDP to be basically our indicator of social health. Well, there you see the confusion. It's talking about money sequences of value, that is all the receipts, all the revenues that are derived from selling goods, and they're confusing that with life reproduction, so that you have built right into this thing from the beginning is a complete conflation of the money and life sequences of value. So we're dealing with a kind of structured delusion that becomes more and more deadly as the money sequence decouples from producing anything at all. So it's a system disorder, and the system disorder seems to be fatal.